You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by David Hencher, Director of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney. David chats about how to fix mobility as a service and proposes a new way to reduce travel and emissions called mobility as a feature. Stay with us.
This is Sean Farrell.
And this is Matt Farrell.
Check out our podcast, Still to be Determined, where we discuss electric vehicles, renewable energy, smart technologies, and more, including which one of us is mom and dad's favorite.
Still to be Determined continues the conversations I start on my YouTube channel, Undecided with Matt Farrell. And I'm clearly the favorite.
This is where I'm supposed to tell you that Still to be Determined can be found anywhere quality podcasts are found, such as Spotify. But since you are the favorite, why don't you do it?
You just did.
Oh, come on.
Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Well, Professor David Hencher, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Great to be here.
Well, great to have you. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a director, in fact, the founding director of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney Business School, which is now 32 years old. We're involved in transport, logistics, supply chain, and we're fairly global. In fact, we're ranked 10th in the world, which is great. And we focus mainly on postgraduate education, masters and PhDs, as well as doing a lot of research in just about any area that's relevant to transportation. So it's a good mix. I have about 30 staff. We have 30 PhDs as well, and about 180 postgrads at the moment in the space. So a pretty busy, active place. And dare I say, I'm very proud of the fact that in January I was given an Order of Australia, which is pretty prestigious. That was really a recognition of my contribution to transport and supply chain over many years, both in Australia and elsewhere.
That's awesome. It sounds really exciting. Exciting time to be a part of transportation as well. I'm wondering, where did this love of transportation come from? When you were growing up, was it something that you'd always thought about, or was it something that came on later in life?
Not really. In fact, although I was born in England and spent early years, and then we went to Kenya. So I was very much brought up in Kenya in East Africa. I went back to the UK in boarding school. I was always interested in economics and engineering, and later on, both in Australia and in the UK, I've studied in the University of New South Wales, Oxford. I met a professor, Michael Beasley, from the London Business School, who's since passed, became a very great friend and a colleague, mentor of mine. And he told me one day as an economist, he thought that transportation was a great application of microeconomics. And at that time, I was going to do work in economic development because that was my interest for Africa. And I'd started looking at transportation and found it fascinating. And I did some undergraduate research on parking, of all things. And when he said, maybe, you should look at the economics of parking, I thought, well, do you mean when I have a date or when I'm, actually seriously thinking about what role it might play? And anyway, that was the beginning. And through Michael Beasley, I got a fascinated interest, and I've never looked back. And I thought being a transport economist, as then I became, it opened up opportunities that maybe were easier to gain reputation than, say, being a monetary economist when there were a dime a dozen.
That's funny. I guess that's true, huh? You can make waves. You can be as popular as Donald Shoup here in the United States.
Absolutely. I know Donald very well. In fact, just for the record, I am now ranked as #1 transport economist in the world in all these rankings that academics seem to listen to, which is really good. And then we've got people from Berkeley and MIT after me. So I'm really proud of that. I've managed that for the last few years. But, I've also spent time at UC Irvine and a lot of time in the USA. So we're all very much a family of committed academics around the world. And I think that's the great thing. And I suppose what I'm proud of more than anything else, even though I wasn't born in Australia, I think I put Australia on the map in this area. And a lot of academics from the USA and from the UK have been attracted to Australia, and they credit me with providing the pathway, if you like to say, it's a good place to go to and live. And I think that's right.
Well, David Levinson is there too.
Indeed.
We know David.
He's at Sydney. Yeah, he joined us about 5 years ago. And Martin Hickman from Arizona is now at the University of Queensland. And I've attracted people from Imperial College, Mike Bell, Delft, Mikkel Blemer, and from Cranfield, Rico Merkit. So we've built up quite a good international team of people who, of course, bring their networks with them, don't they? And if you know David, of course, he has a wonderful network as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so you're in Sydney. What is the transportation landscape there? What interests you most about the local activities that happen?
Well, it's a very broad interest, not only in passenger, but also in freight. I mean, only about 20% of all trips pre-COVID were by public transport. At the moment, we've only had a return of about 65 to 75% back to public transport. And the cars are getting back onto the roads and causing congestion. And depending on where you are, it's worse than pre-COVID, but it's actually better in some areas. What we're generally finding, and what interests me, is that the peaks have dropped a bit and the off-peaks have increased in terms of the amount of activity we're seeing. But possibly the most exciting thing, Jeff, is the work we've been doing, as have many, on working from home over the last few years to show that that's really changed the landscape. And I regard working from home as the greatest unintended positive consequence of COVID. And it's created one of the strongest transport policy opportunities that we've ever had in terms of taking pressure off the CBDs, but also, more importantly, growing the interest in living locally and the interest in active travel, especially walking and cycling. So what interests me is really how these all interact through a system-wide approach to actually improve society in terms of accessibility, decarbonisation benefits as well that are happening. We're doing a lot of work actually on alternative fuels, and I think it's fascinating. One of the things I often tell all those people that love electric vehicles is that, they're great at the end to reduce the emissions of the tailpipe. That's not the whole story, of course. There's still 30% more somewhere else lurking around. But of course, if you don't change the pricing model, as these vehicles become generally more acceptable, the price drops and the cost of using them is lower, we're going to have worse congestion than we've ever had before. And in terms of sustainability, while the car might be delivering sustainability on reduced emissions, it's not helping public transport because people will tend to stay or increase their use of the car. My old adage, a car is a car is a car, whether it's electric, petrol, diesel, or autonomous. Is that a good story for the future? I'm not sure.
I've often wondered, the car has a specific shape and design to it. And, because we're going off into these new ideas about what transportation is, will we continue to have this inertia of car design and, the size of it? As you said, a car is a car is a car. And so it begs to almost be changed because times are changing, it feels like.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've been promoting almost since the 70s when I first got interested in transportation is road pricing reform, which we know politically is just not on. I mean, we need to move away from fixed registration charges to distance-based charges. And we did some really interesting work a few years ago that showed that if you were to halve the registration charge in Sydney for cars, have a 5 cents a kilometre distance-based charge only in the peaks, morning and afternoon, but not in the off-peaks, you would reduce peak hour traffic by 6% and nobody would be financially worse off. And you only have to do the calculation on typical kilometres in the peak and the saving in registration to prove that. But of course, people don't do the calculation and they say, Hencher, you're an idiot. What are you trying to do? Give us more expenses, including trucking guys that have always been very negative towards my views on this because they will benefit by having less traffic on the roads and they don't get it. But having said all that, 6% reduction in Sydney, I'm sure this is in some other cities in the US, is almost returning you to school holiday periods. And people normally say, isn't the traffic great during the vacation periods, but awful in the other periods, That's the sell. And one of the TV stations picked that up and said, oh, yeah, that's the magical statement, Let's return the traffic to school holidays. And Hencher's come up with a suggestion that makes sense.
That's what we talk about here in San Francisco is when everybody goes to Burning Man, it clears up a bunch.
Yes. And, I've got another comment from a politician who's now a friend. He's retired from politics. He said, when he was the Minister of Transport, he said, Hencher, wash your mouth out. And now that he's not a politician, he actually agrees with me. That's life,
Oh,
isn't it?
that's politics, isn't it? I guess that's how it unfortunately works sometimes. Do you think work from home is sticky? Do you think it's going to stick around
Yes.
and permanent change?
We've been doing surveys since March 2020, and we're still doing them. And I think we started pretty early to capture the sense. And it's quite similar to what people have found in the USA. I think we're going to be talking about in Sydney an average of just over 1 or 2 days a week for particular occupations. And although it might be more a Monday or a Friday, but not too much, it's fairly evenly spread through the week, which is encouraging because that has impacts on transport network performance. It will, and I think flexibility is here to stay. And just in the USA, from the work that was done from Stanford, which I follow with the guys I know over there, one of the great surprises and the great delights is that employers were as supportive as employees. Putting aside the fact that quite a lot of employers have reduced their office space, which is a saving, they're starting to now realize that work-life balance for an employee is really important, and that if they want to maintain a good workforce, they need to recognize that. And even we're seeing increasingly employment contracts having that built in where people are saying, we like the flexibility, and if they're going to stay in an organization, they need to honor it. Now, of course, it doesn't apply to everybody. There are those that are essential workers that have to be face-to-face, which does raise equity issues in the future about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
But on balance, I think it's been a good outcome and it's here to stay.
There was an article yesterday in The Atlantic. There was a research study showing that work from home actually has contributed to a baby bump in the United States. You had a crash in 2020, but in 2021 and 2022, you're seeing more babies being born. And that's partially because of the flexibility of the work from home situation. And I found that really interesting too. I mean, there's all these connections economically and socially to this work from home kind of movement for, like you said, folks that can work from home.
It could be right. But of course, I haven't heard that one in Australia. That's rather interesting. I always relate that one to whenever there's electricity failure in India, 9 months later, there's a growth in babies being born. But no, that's a fascinating one, Jeff. I'll look into that. But we certainly also know, and it's important to mention, that some have said there've been some negative mental health impacts of working from home, which to some extent was true during the lockdown periods. But really, I'm referring to out of lockdown, even in areas which are no longer what we would be concerned about with voluntary lockdown, because people were still concerned to go out and about. But now, with vaccination rates being reasonably high, people are generally not wearing masks and getting out and about and trying to live the next normal. But what I will say is that a lot of the mental health issues were there before COVID, and we've done a lot of work on well-being and happiness. And we're convinced that there's been a net positive because the stress of commuting has been quite high, and the flexibility of being able to undertake a mix of leisure at times that suits you better when you're working from home. About half of the saving in commuting time, and commuting time is typically 7 or 8 hours a week in Sydney by working from home on the average, and people only worked from home to some extent, has been converted into roughly half of that's been additional work productivity gain to the employer, and the other half's been roughly leisure, of which roughly 20% of the leisure is out of home, walking, cycling, relaxing, going to the shops, and the rest is in home. That's really good evidence to suggest that working from home, I can't find many negatives on working from home in terms of people that do it to some extent. It's not an all or nothing. It used to annoy me in the beginning when people said they work from home or they don't. Well, what the devil does that mean? 1 day, 2 days? And I think we've got to get the language correct. And I think it's been a good outcome. And in Western societies, it seems to be stabilizing. And the recent evidence in Sydney says we've almost got the number where I think it will be in the future, which is going to help transport planners in forecasting, reprioritizing infrastructure, and so on.
I found that when I started working from home in 2014, so way before the pandemic. I was actually already ready for it, I guess, when it got here. But I did find that for me, it actually improved my health outlook. I felt like I was healthier. I felt like I could sleep longer and those types of things, which I needed. But then on the other hand of it, I missed my colleagues that I had before, and the people, water cooler discussions and things like that. But that wasn't a partial work from home or anything like that. I just started working for myself and working in my office here in my house. And so I think that might be a different situation than partial, like you were mentioning,
Absolutely.
Day here, day there, which you still get those social interactions, but you're also, being able to have some of that family time as well.
That's a very powerful point, because we often say people don't go to work, they go to work to socially interact. And absolutely right. But how much do you need? I mean, we generally work on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and that's about right. It's really enjoyable. And as a result, most colleagues go in on those days. It's interesting in Australia with public service, which of course is huge. They basically have a view that the team coordinator decides when everybody should be in the office and when they're not. And Transport for New South Wales, most of those people are at home 3 days a week. Looks like continuing, which I find fascinating, and I was surprised. I thought the bosses would be saying you need to be in there more often, but they're saying no.
Huh, interesting. Well, let's chat about mobility as a feature, mobility as a service.
Yes.
First off, let's kind of define mobility as a service first, the MOS, as I'll call it. I guess the rest of the show, use the acronym instead of the whole phrase. But what is mobility as a service, at least in theory?
In very simple terms, it's an integrative process to develop an ecosystem where you can integrate in a very simple way through a digital platform information that gives you about a number of ways in which you could travel. And it provides, hence, a one-stop convenience solution to where you can find information about traveling. But on top of that, it also provides incentives to maybe get you to consider more sustainable modes of transportation in your overall travel patterns. I have to say it is more than a trip planning app, because a trip planning app can basically give you information, which is great, like Google as well. It's designed to really change travel behavior in a sustainable way that's aligned with societal goals like reducing emissions and reducing congestion and so on. And if it doesn't do that, then we're suggesting that MAS as a digital platform may not be of great value to bring the sort of outcomes that we might aspire to as a society.
And that brings up kind of the idea of like, what are the limitations? What are the limitations of MOS as it's being implemented now, or as kind of how it's controlled through transportation companies and through that side of the business?
Oh, it's huge. We just had a advice given to Transport Main Roads in Queensland the other day, where we're suggesting one of the great problems we're finding is it's become more of what Sampo Hetinen from WIM says is an ecosystem rather than ecosystem. I like that, because I think that the suppliers of transportation are just showing such limited interest because they don't think there's any financial attractiveness when it comes to, the rideshare guys, the bicycle guys and all that sort of people. When it comes to government, who's mainly the provider of public transport, they seem besotted with the idea that somehow MAS is going to change travel behavior and get lots of people using public transport. But by the way, we're not going to subsidize it any more than we do at the moment through MAS. So we're not convinced that having an app to know what's going on is necessarily going to be enough to make a difference to change your behavior, because many people are creatures of habit, and the changes in service levels that are going to be required are not enough to make them go variety seeking and change their behavior. It will at the margin, but it won't make much of a difference. But the biggest issue is who's going to be the aggregator or the broker in making this happen, and who's going to provide the financial incentives to support the switching behavior. I have to say that in transportation, and you would know this, Jeffrey, that it's levels of service that really determine your choices, not how much you pay. And MAS can only offer financial incentives. It can't offer unique rideshare services or unique public transport to people who subscribe to MAS. So at the moment, it's stuck in a hole. It's niche. It's not likely to be scalable as it's being interpreted at the moment. So the question is, what do we need to do to break that nexus so it has a chance? And I think it's been pretty much doom and gloom to date, with a lot of people getting excited about it, but not much being delivered. And if I could just finish my comment by way of Sampo Hetinen, who was my co-author in my Mobility as a Feature, who was really the pioneer in this stuff through WIM in Finland. He has basically said it's just not working. He's relied on venture capital for a long time, and then he's run out, and he still hasn't developed a profitable market. So we started asking ourselves, and I'm happy to share other things beyond MAF, as to what we need to do to give it a chance.
Yeah, I read a piece that he just recently wrote in ITS, and I was stung by this quote. If MOS cannot get money used for car ownership, it will struggle to be sustainable. Liberate the money used for car ownership, It will struggle to be sustainable.
So I'm going to share a really interesting way of solving that problem with you this morning, which we didn't talk about in MAF. but it's linked to math. And both of us sort of started off with the view that we've got to think outside of transport suppliers to give this a chance.
I just find that really fascinating. And when I first read the MAF article, Mobility is a Future, I was really fascinated, and it just reminded me of a couple of things. And I'm wondering if this is actually the case, but like reverse airline miles. So, with airline miles, you travel a bunch and you get points that can turn into cash and rewards. But for this, you have goods and services that you're trying to get, and maybe they give you travel rewards on the opposite side. It feels like a reversing of some of the standard operating procedures for some companies, travel companies.
Well, it does, and it's challenging. And often when people say MAS is like Netflix, I'd said I don't quite get that. I guess, let me give you a couple of points which I think are really important.
Sure.
First of all, multimodal has to be much broadly interpreted than it has been to date. And I think we've got to bring the car, be it a private car or car sharing, into the mix in a serious way in order to find a way of getting the VKM reduced. The offers of transport services within the current MAS framework that most of the app developers get excited about are just too limited to achieve that. So what we're proposing is that maybe the problem is that we've got the wrong broker, i.e. government. And even though they sort of have a sense that they should lead this exercise, well, they've not done anything to convince me that they've made a difference to date. And so I believe that what we need to do is as follows, and this isn't new. I think I upset some government people yesterday who didn't quite like the idea because it wasn't aligned with their control. I said, stop the word control, let's work on partnership. So here goes, ready?
Sure,
this is the story. The way I think it should happen is that we have a competitive tendering framework, and we invite a range of anybody that wants to deliver MAS through what we call a consortium. You can set up a consortium and you can be government, or you could be a private company like an insurance company or a bank. And you can invite the transport suppliers with their own apps. And this is really important because these guys don't want to share. They don't want to share a lot of the data that comes out of their own apps. I'll tell you what you can share in a minute, to put in tenders, right? And then what we do, we might select 6 of them in a location, but we want to make sure those 6 have full coverage of all the modes, including the car, because we're trying to really change travel behavior. And we've got to make the car, we've got to have an incentive directly hitting the car rather than, because to change the car, you have to make it less attractive, or there is a reward to make you want to reduce car use. So supposing we've got 6 winners. Now, they have to agree in the bidding process to join what we call a common framework. The common framework is the way in which their apps are connected into a common framework that delivers information to users to be able to make choices. Users can choose 1 or more apps to subscribe to, but in order for the app developers or the consortium to get some rewards that are attractive for them to participate, they've got to share certain amounts of data back to the common framework, which is either owned by a private company or owned by government, to show that if they can reduce VKT of cars, for example, or reduce emissions, then they will be given some financial rewards, which will be not only delivered back to the users of your app, but also to the suppliers into the app. And this is the way of making sure there's a competitive market and to make sure that all the modes are delivering on sustainable outcomes. Now, if it turns out that any of these consortium dealers cannot deliver on the KPIs related to the societal goals, they don't get any rewards, right? The users do not get any rewards either. And so it has no value in terms of the ecosystem that we're trying to develop. Now, the beauty of this, Jeffrey, since one of the greatest problems has been data sharing, is that many of these consortia only need to share aggregate data through to the common platform in order to be eligible to get the rewards. The financial rewards or the non-financial rewards could be points. Right? Now, on top of that layer, what's great about an insurance company is they're multi-service. They're not multi-modal. They essentially don't own modes. They deliver services to the market. And those services can be reduced insurance premiums, lower costs on maintenance of your car, direct incentives through even buying a car, or even we're willing to give you points if you switch your VKT into public transport, because they have the ability to cross-subsidize and still maintain profits. I can tell you, and I'm sure you would agree, that a public transport authority does not have that capability. They do not have any control of a huge amount of the market, which is driven by car choices. Multi-service or math is well aligned with this idea, because even the insurance companies can go to people which they already go to, and if you insure with us, you'll get discounts at the shops, at the cinemas, on holidays, you name it. A government agency has no capability of doing that, even though they always tell me they're talking to people about it. And I said, well, where's the outcome, mate? Oh, we're working on it.
I find it really interesting because I feel like you're right. The insurance companies do have a connection into a broader world. And it's something that, the transit agencies here in the United States, at least, and I imagine around the world, are cash strapped always. They're always, trying to just barely provide service. And so reaching outside of the one box they have control of is really important. And so I'm wondering how this connection to broader business banks or insurance companies or anything like that, they have an incentive, obviously, if you're a car insurer, right, to reduce vehicle miles traveled, VKT. But how do you get them to kind of get over that hump to where we're not just an insurance company, we're trying to have a sustainable outcome?
Well, first of all, banks are getting very much involved, of course, in account-based payment systems, and they are becoming a really central feature of MAS. We could reach the stage, as one of our colleagues, who's now the Minister of Transport in Chile, said, well, why do I need to join MAS? I've got an American Express account, and I can go and pay on the bus, on the train, and rideshare. As long as I can do that, I don't see the point of all this. And it's a valid point. But having said that, there is a thing, I'm not sure what you call it in the USA, it's called the social license. And the social license is a concept to do with being a good citizen. And many of these big companies have a set of rules that they work with, and like they want to tick a box that says, yeah, we're supporting sustainable travel for our staff and things like this, or we're supporting sustainable outcomes for society as a whole by providing incentives and so on. So if you come and insure with us or bank with us, we'll give you some reward points. Of course, this is a competitive market, which enables, provided you use it in a sustainable way, and here's a list of what you need to do. And so the social license has become something that many big companies have been wondering about. Well, what do we have to do to tick that box? Well, hang on, guys. Here's a tickable solution.
That's getting harder here in the United States. As we talked about earlier, it's very political. People on the right are, attacking companies who are trying to fill out their, as you mentioned, a social license. Here, I think it's called ESG or something along those lines.
It's linked to that stuff, yeah. It's the United Nations stuff, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so it's interesting to see how the politics get in the way of these things. But if the companies want to do it, they think they make money. I don't see why they shouldn't, but it is becoming somewhat political from that perspective. And I hate it because it's really annoying.
Well, I'm totally in agreement with you, but I'm suggesting that these are different pathways that might give MAS a future. And in fact, it's interesting with Sampo, what was the connection that got him excited, even though he and I were on the same wavelength for many years now, was when he had an insurance company in Italy that was willing to put in some money into WIM, which we mentioned in the paper. And that led to him thinking, well, this might be the way to go. And then off the record, it might be in the public domain now, I'm not sure, that Milan, and I think they read chapter 8 of our book on mobility, which we published a few years ago, they put out to tender, and I think they was going to choose 8 providers of MAS products. And as long as they delivered on certain criteria to do with sustainability, then they can go and play in the market, and the government would actually provide some funding to them. But they had to deliver appropriate outcomes. Just winning the tender didn't guarantee you got all that money. They were willing to offer them a minimum, but they had to. That wouldn't be enough to make a profit.
Could companies do this on their own without being part of a larger consortium?
Sure, you can. Absolutely. I mean, the actual consortium could be one player. I mean, by the way, the insurance companies, they could either be the common framework tendering authority, if you like, or they could be a consortium bidding if the government wants to control the tendering authority. So it could go either way. And in fact, we're currently writing a new book, which we decided because Elsevier wanted us to do a second edition of our MAS book. I'm not sure if you saw it, but we decided we'd sooner write a book on the future of MAS in terms of all the challenges, call it MAS version 2. And we've started developing what we call a new utopian framework. I sort of hinted at it today when I spoke to you. It's a framework in which we think we've been around long enough to learn the lessons about how this thing may or may not work. And, it does come down to trusting partnerships and a whole bunch of things like that. And I think one of the issues we're suffering from at the moment is that there's too many people in this business that develop an app and they call it MAS. And that's so misleading and it's just nonsense. They're trip planners, nothing more, nothing less. And all the other aspects need to be built in terms of the common framework, the incentive structures, the coverage of all the modes, the integration of non-transport suppliers from multi-service who are going to provide a cross-subsidy solution. And that's why we suddenly realized that, wow, insurance companies have that anyway. They don't need to be transport suppliers, but they need to encourage transport suppliers to join their consortium and get a value out of it because we can provide you with a profit line. So unless that happens, and that's why tendering is good as well, because then you still have competition in the market, because many of the people say, we want to do our own thing and compete. Well, you can compete, but there's some protection here by saying that the rewards will be limited only to a few competitors.
Outside of insurance companies and banks, do you see other opportunities with companies? I went to CES a number of years ago, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, where they try to wow you with all of these fantastical technological advances that aren't actually quite here yet. But, I was invited by Here Technologies, which is a mapping company. And one of their things that they were trying to sell is like they get all these telematics and data from the roads, from the cars that drive that use their mapping technologies. And they were saying like, oh, well, we can partner with a Starbucks. If it's just your phone, not even a car, you walk in front of the Starbucks and they can, basically give you a discount, right, as you're walking by the store. And so they want to use their real-time mapping, software to do this kind of benefits program for people so that they can partner and use advertising in their systems. And I'm wondering, like, outside of like insurance companies, banks, and those things, if there's like a larger ecosystem, or maybe you're already thinking of the larger ecosystem and I just have, quarantined it myself.
Fair point. In fact, I think the ecosystem should invite anybody that believes they can get value out of it. I should also mention that in order to be able to provide some of the rewards through things like reduced VKT, vehicle miles traveled, then all users must capture that data back to the common framework or to the apps that they belong to through their smartphones. That this has to be a condition. In fact, if they turn their phone off, they can't get the rewards because we're not capturing any change in their vehicle kilometers. We need to agree on a time period as well. This is an important point. But you need a starting point of vehicle kilometers, and then you need a point at which you can see a change to know if that's actually changing. And we need to work that through very carefully. And the common framework will make sure there's no double dipping, because if you subscribe to two app or consortia, they could be capturing your vehicle miles traveled twice, and you don't want to be. The common framework's not going to reward you twice. But to be honest, anywhere where you can capture a value that someone is willing to offer financial discounts into the common framework is great. But once we've got a common framework, and I love the language that we're trying to develop, and you've got consortia contributing through a tendering process to get started, we need to demonstrate that this thing's got legs, right? And I think that's the problem at the moment. We've all done trials. I think the Sydney trial is the best, but they haven't delivered an outstandingly strong idea that even with subscription fees and discounts and all that you're actually going to make super profits anywhere. They're pretty marginal. They're not changing travel behavior at all. And I always say, Jeffrey, and this is a really important point, all these people that say, I'm doing MAS on LinkedIn, and Hencher gets himself into trouble all the time. I say, can you please tell me whether this has changed travel behavior or not in sustainable ways? Well, they either don't reply or they don't know.
Right. It's just an app or an idea to them. I find that interesting too, is another thing you mentioned was, transportation companies are a hard, kind of thing to crack. But also it's not just the public transit agencies, it's also these private kind of walled garden groups. I imagine like Uber, the Lyfts of the world, those types of organizations, they kind of want to control it too. And they want to call themselves MOS, but they're not. They're just providing a service inside of their app to get bike share or, whatever modes of transportation they control.
Absolutely right. In fact, when we first worked with Uber on our Sydney trial, they didn't want to be involved because they wanted the app to be called Uber. They didn't want it to be called this multimodal generic one that we developed, which turned out to be Tripic, working with Skedgo, one of the platform developers who, they misuse the language as well. And Uber said to us, which was rather interesting, because if you wanted to see the effectiveness of MaaS, you've got to identify travel behavior change that's consequential, not only those modal changes occurring within the modes of the app, but also outside. So, for example, if you don't have in the app all the modes of transportation, you don't have a mechanism of tracking all the travel that people do outside the app, you don't know whether there's been a good outcome from a societal point of view. And that's what government should be interested in, not in, we've just got a new whiz-dang app. Uber told us that they wouldn't join if Didi or Ola joined. And then it turned out that the discounts that we're able to offer through Uber in MaaS were not as attractive as the base fare for Didi or Ola outside the app. So people who had joined our subscription program were using outside services more than the ones inside MaaS. But we didn't know that until we did some follow-ups with them. So how would you have known unless you're tracking this jolly stuff to know if MaaS has worked? I think that too many organizations now are simply thinking that if they provide a transport service, they're providing MaaS if they link two modes together. So Transport for New South Wales started off by offering discounts on parking your car at the station if you use the train. And if you parked at the station and didn't use the train, you pay the full fare, the full parking cost. And they call that MaaS. Bad news is people were then driving their car to the station to park instead of catching the bus. Is that a sustainable solution?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so.
There's a lot of contradiction between all these multimodal service providers that are actually not necessarily delivering the good sustainable outcome because they're into another mode that might not be as good as the one that you were using before.
So when you go and present this idea to folks, their reaction was negative, you said, but what were they saying? Like, why couldn't it work for them?
Well, deep down, I think they still have a sense that they want to control the game. We got a presentation yesterday from Transport and Main Roads Queensland through a consultant who they've hired to co-design. And I just didn't agree with it because it was all about how we can have in the centre the government agency running the show. And I think that's a problem. And they kept using the word control. And I thought, well, they don't the private sector guys don't like that. They want to partner with you, but they don't trust you. And where are the financial incentives? Oh, they haven't got an answer. The thing is that you can provide financial incentives through a trial because you put them aside. But when the trial's finished, who's going to fund the financial incentives? And that's what led us to move away from relying on government, because they've not shown any appetite for that, into the private sector, which has got the wherewithal to cross-subsidize to make this thing attractive, but still make a profit. And that's our point.
So what's this look like in your mind at the moment? Like, what's the structural framework? Like, let's say we're 10 years in the future and this is working and there's an organization or a group that's providing these services. How does it work exactly? Like, what is the way that it works where it's the perfect implementation idea?
It's a great point. We've almost written this up. We're working on it. In 10 years' time, let's just work on an insurance company is committed and they're the tendering authority. In other words, they invited consortia, which could be made of modal and other non-modal service providers to get together, and they have their own app that feeds all their services into it. They bid, and they're a successful winner amongst 6. The common framework has made sure that they get a good spread of consortia that actually are covering all the modes of transport, and the ones that would be particularly interested in are those that are actually able to at least recognise the use of the car and track the car in their app in order to be able to be eligible for getting lots of interesting rewards because they're doing good things, right? If you don't have those modes in your app, you're at a great disadvantage, or they don't need to be in the app, but you need to capture non-MaaS services that a person are utilising. So the insurance company has said, well, we're going to, the public transport authorities have agreed to still continue to provide the subsidised fares, which they currently do. They're not giving anything extra. If they can, that's a bonus, but I doubt they're going to give the same fares that you get outside of MaaS. But the insurance company is going to say, if you join us through the common platform and subscribe through one of these apps, we will give you certain immediate discounts on insurance premiums, on maintenance of your car, or other whatever you want. But we'll also give additional rewards to not only you as a user, but also the consortium, if through tracking we see major changes in your travel behavior that aligns with good societal outcomes, e.g. reduced car use. And even if it's an electric car, that's still a good societal outcome because it reduces congestion, even if it doesn't reduce emissions at the tailpipe. That's the model. And what we've been struggling with is finding a subsidy model, because we need one, but it's a cross-subsidy model in the case of the insurance companies, and it still has a profitable bottom line for their business because it grows their business. If government is running it, I don't think they could deliver on that.
I find it really fascinating because I think that it's something that these insurance companies are already doing. Like, for example, I have non-auto operating insurance. So if I'm walking on the street or if I'm biking and I get hit by a car, I still have insurance that's focused on travel. But they also, what they do is they have good driver discounts where basically if you don't get in a collision, you get a discount during the year. They're starting to think about discounts for reduced VMT already. Like if you only have a limited amount of driving that you do a year, they'll give you a discount for that too. There's also pay as you go per mile insurance that some companies are offering here in California, I know. And they offer rental car discounts and things like that already. You can go on to USA.com and you get discount on Avis and Hertz and all those other companies that do this. So it seems like they're already set up for it. And so I can see where it would actually work out, really well, because it's something that almost they're already doing to a certain extent.
Absolutely. And the same in Australia, IAG, who did the trial with us, that own NRMA, the major motoring association, that own a bunch of rental car companies like Hertz, for example, do that already. And that's what's great about it, because it's just another product in their set. And it's one that they can see some value in adding it in without taking the risk. The whole financial exercise dependent on the mass product alone. And I think trying to put the mass product on an island without all that cross-subsidy capability and the right set of incentives to get people to change their behavior is doomed. We're going to have awful difficulties with government agencies who think they run the show. I mean, Transport for New South Wales have introduced, they've got a thing called Opal. That's our electronic card, for travel. It's very good. But they've introduced Opal Plus. And what Opal Plus is, a whole bunch of you go online and you indicate your typical travel, and they tell you this is a good subscription program for you because it'll save you some money. And it's convenient because you then, tap and go, we can do it anyway. Anyway, we went through all their possibilities. I got a postdoc to look at them. And not one of them saved any money except one of them on a ferry, $2 a week. And to make it worse, Jeffrey, they said, oh, well, isn't it great? Because if you subscribe, we'll give you discounts on parking your car at certain parking stations. What? Okay. So some people are saying, well, I don't want to use public transport, mate, but I will subscribe to get my parking discount and I'll continue to drive my car.
Yeah. So there's a negative incentive almost.
Yeah. And there's a failure to look at the full multimodal implications of a system-wide solution to deliver sustainability. Unfortunately, people in government, as good friends as they are, they don't want to know because they want to control the thing, That's why we need insurance companies to step and say, hang on, we're going to move into this space and we're going to show you how to do it.
And this should work in not just urban areas too, but rural areas and areas outside of cities. There's a lot of folks that don't have cars that are still in need of transportation. They need to get to doctor's appointments. They need to get to other engagements that they have, but they don't have transportation necessarily. So this could benefit them as well.
Absolutely. In fact, when you say they don't have cars, and the car ownership rate in our rural regional areas is quite high, and it's poor public transport. Well, we've come up with another idea that's interesting, which we haven't linked it, called a car mobility club. And this is not your car next door or whatever. So basically how it works is, and this is where you have a platform and you develop an algorithm, that people who want to, say, disadvantaged people who want to travel long distances, they register for free. Those who are traveling long distances by car and have a sort of an interest in allowing someone to travel with them from time to time will register for free. The membership is the way of checking and screening that people are safe, secure, the cars are up to scratch, and so on and so on. And then when someone wants to go from A to B, they log in and say, I'd like to go from A to B at a certain time of the day. And someone who's got a car gets told that, this person wants to travel. Yes, I'm happy to take them. And then we have a donation scheme. Membership's free. Say, okay, how much are you willing to contribute to the driver? Say $20. Okay, well, how about we take $20 and give the driver 10 and 10 to run the membership program? Neato.
Yeah.
We're going to test this soon. It's an idea we've been developing in a project which we call Regional Town and Rural Hinterland Mass.
Nice. I really like all these ideas. You must come up with lots of ideas all the time that, some work, some don't, I'm sure, but absolutely. I find it fun and fascinating.
And at the end of the day, it all comes down to institutional issues, governance, and trust.
Those are the three things. That's it.
IGP.
Well, let's solve those. Let's solve those. Then it'll be easy, right?
We're working on it. You know, you just got to keep at it, Jeffrey. And you win some, you lose some. But we think we've got a model that actually has legs, as long as we don't get government trying to run it.
Well, you know, here in the United States, I want to go back to that quote, Sampo's quote of liberating money from private car ownership. I think there's so much money being spent. People buying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 cars. They spend $10,000 a year on operating expenses, on everything else. There's got to be a way to figure out how we can take that money that's being misappropriated to a certain extent, especially in cities, and use it for the greater good. And I think that's where you're headed.
We're trying our best. In fact, we hope in the longer term to move from personal car use to car sharing, where the insurance companies can offer an even better incentive in terms of your VKT if you take it up through a car sharing program rather than your personal vehicle. So these are all extensions along the way. But, you know, the challenge is that most people, when they make travel choices based on the marginal costs, and they don't consider the ownership costs. And, you know, at the end of the day, a little bit of road pricing, this is where government could contribute. The distance-based charging could help, because they do have control over that, but they're not interested.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to post the paper in the show notes when the podcast is released, but where can folks find your work if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
I guess really they should just email me initially. On the ITLS web, we do have a section under projects and research, which is mobility as a service. There's a link there. But this new stuff that I'm talking about is not out there yet.
Yep.
You're the first of two people that have seen it, heard about it. And yesterday I just sent a draft. I don't mind sending it to you, but it's not for wide distribution, if you like.
Sure. That sounds great. Well, David Hencher, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I've really enjoyed the journey of conversation.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.